Now, Michael, there are a lot of managers watching this video as well. People who, and probably brokers, owners, investment groups. You know, what are some of the techniques or tips that we can give them in helping them properly guide their agents to better qualifying sellers or buyers, or even in general creating an atmosphere within their office where there seems to be a higher commitment on the part of the agents that are working with them? Because, you know, I think one of the things that really can lead to a difficult situation in a brokerage or in a market center or in an office is when you have a lot of agents who are non-productive, and there may be a handful that are. High-producing agents don't want to be associated with agents who are not. They want to make sure that everybody in their organization is creating leads, properly qualifying sellers, properly qualifying buyers, and that there's a team effort, that there's a groundswell of listings or qualified buyers coming into the office. And for those people who are top producers, they don't want to be affiliated with an office where 95% of the agents aren't doing that much and they're doing almost all the work. So what are some of the things that we can work on with managers, broker owners, investors, ownership groups, give them some techniques about how they can change the atmosphere within their company if necessary?
Well, I think if it's necessary, first of all, as a former manager, you spend the time with the people who are committed. That's number one.
I want to stop you right there, because this is very important. What most managers do is put 95% of their effort and time into the agents who are non-productive and try to drag them across the finish line.
I agree.
Rather than putting their time and energy into the ones who are displaying commitment, right?
Absolutely.
So we have to point this out. I see this in company after company and brokerage after brokerage where the management team is putting all their energy and effort into people who are only interested in the business.
Sure.
They're not committed to the business. And we want them to reverse that. We want them to put 95% of their time into the agents and teams that are committed to the business, and then recruiting other people who are going to be committed to the business, not interested.
Well, absolutely, John. And the challenge becomes is that they feel they have to do that because they need the sheer numbers to reach their financial goals. And the bottom line is this: if I focus on that top 20% and I can get my top 20% to sell 5, 10, 20% more real estate, well, I'm winning all day long, because that part that I'm dragging behind me, they're just never going to get it. They may do 1 deal or 2 deals or 3 deals here eventually. It just doesn't work. So obviously identifying that principle up front is a very key. The second, though, is having ongoing, consistent training in your market centers, in your offices, in your brokerage companies.
Consistency is the key word here, because we see in a lot of organizations it's the flavor of the month this month. And if that doesn't work, then we're going to switch gears and we're going to give you some other kind of training. And then 3 months from now, we're going to give you another kind of training. And they keep changing the training methodologies because they think that the training's not working. It's not the training that isn't working, it's the agents who are not working, and there's a lack of accountability on the part of management to get the agents to follow through in the training most of the time, right?
Well, it is, and it's a different message every month. It's that, like you said, it's that flavor of the month. And I think the key thing, though, is, whatever you're going to do, you work through a process of consistency that on a weekly, even daily basis. Things like creating a morning session to review scripts and dialogues, where you can get people to come in and do that, to build that excitement, to build that momentum. But here's the key thing: you've got to have the right people doing that as well. So if you've got people who are just coming, to shoot the breeze and just to be there to complain and bitch and moan and whine about how bad their businesses are, you got to keep those folks out. So I think the key thing is building that momentum, but it's also then attracting that talent. For me as a former manager, sure, I love new agents, but the only way that agent would join our firm would be A, they have to go through specific training. B, we have a set standard of production requirements that they will need to meet after a certain period of time. And if we're not setting those standards, then shame on you, because guess what? You're going to have someone there 6 months from now who's taking up desk space, who's taking up your time, who's taking up your energy, and you are losing money.